Well, good afternoon. The psalm for today is Psalm number 69. And if ever we needed a psalm, I think we need a psalm here in my house today. Save me, O God, for the waters are come in, even unto my soul. I stick fast in the deep mire where no ground is. I am come into deep waters so that the floods run over me. I am weary of crying, my throat is dry, my sight fails me for waiting so long upon my God. They that hate me without cause are more than the hairs on my head. They that are mine enemies would destroy me guiltless. They are mighty. I paid them things that I never took, God. You know my sinfulness, and my faults are not hid from you. Let not them that trust in thee, O God of hosts, be ashamed for my cause. Let not those that seek thee be confounded through me. O Lord God of Israel. This is the word of the Lord. So what I want to do today is give you an overview of the end of the Cold War, focusing particularly on Ronald Reagan. I'm afraid this means I'm going to neglect critical aspects of the Reagan presidency. I'm going to share my screen here with you for a sec. Because we simply don't have time to talk about Reagan's domestic policy and his influence on American politics. We might circle back to some of these things in later lectures. So our purpose today is to sort of get from Richard Nixon into the successful kind of end of the Cold War, and really to come to terms with Reagan. Reagan brought a tremendous change in tone in American politics. He changed policy somewhat dramatically, although perhaps not as dramatically as he would have liked. And we should evaluate whether or not like American government fundamentally changes. Conservatives talk about Reagan the way liberals talk about FDR or Lyndon Johnson, but was Reagan in fact a realignment president? Did he create new ways of governing? And I'm actually not entirely certain whether or not he was that kind of success. I do think in terms of his foreign policy that he dramatically shifted. And so if you want to talk about Reagan as a statesman, this is really the best place in which we can lay out the issues. But let's start by circling back to Richard Nixon. Nixon made three primary successful contributions to American foreign policy. The first is that he got American soldiers out of Vietnam. He did this in part by escalating the war in Vietnam, in part by building stable relationships with the South Vietnamese government so that they could rest and stand on their own two feet, and in part by getting so close to the Russians that the Chinese felt like they needed to back off in North Vietnam. The second major accomplishment is a word that we've used before, but I don't know if you've ever seen it on a slide or on the board, but the word is détente. It means a de-escalation of tensions. We talked about Kissinger and Nixon's successful kind of approach to Russia, which led to the strategic arms limitation talks, this kind of restrictions on nuclear missiles that both sides agreed to. This is generally seen as being successful in its own time, although in 1975, this comes to a crashing halt with the fall of Saigon, with the removal of Johnson and the struggles of Gerald Ford to create another stable presidency. And generally, with Americans on the left, their general kind of disdain for the military and shame for what the veterans had done. There are atrocity stories about Vietnam, just like there were atrocity stories about Iraq. And it did have a significant impact on the American intelligentsia. But generally speaking, the Cold War gets less intense during Nixon's presidency. This is something I referred to when we were talking about the Cold War in the Eisenhower administration. But there's a powerful visual image of the Cold War, and actually I'm kicking myself for not putting it into my PowerPoint. But it was the front cover of the Bulletin of Atomic Science, and it was always a clock that was just a few minutes to midnight. In 1953, it was 2 minutes to midnight with the intensification of the Korean War. Well, by 1963, after the Cuban Missile Crisis and after they put the red phone in the White House and the Kremlin so that the presidents could talk to each other, The clock is actually down to 12 minutes. So the Cold War now seems like it maybe not, like the nuclear conflict isn't about to happen. Well, in 68, it had gone back up to 7 minutes. Nothing like it was in 1953, but there was really a sense that the war had gotten more intense. Maybe code yellow would be a good way to describe it. Well, by 1972, by Richard Nixon's reelection in the midst of the Vietnam talks, they put the clock back to 12 minutes, as if, well, it seems like we've reached some kind of rapprochement. And then what happens over the next decade? By 1980, by the year in which Reagan wins the election, the clock is back at 4 minutes. And so one of the things we want to figure out in the next 4 or 5 minutes is, well, why? Why is it that the clock was so close to midnight? And then in 1984, after one of Reagan's terms, the clock was at 3 minutes to midnight. Now, of course, this doesn't last. When the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, they set the clock to 17 minutes to midnight. And I think in 2007 or 2008, which is the last time I even bothered to look at the clock, I think it was 25 minutes to midnight. So the Cold War is essentially over now. Like the risk of nuclear exchange with the Russians seems really, really non-existent. But in that core part of Reagan's presidency, it seemed like it had gotten much, much hotter. And it was closer than it had been at any time since Stalin was president. So Reagan is really a complicated factor in the Cold War. On the one hand, he seems like he wins it. On the other hand, it seems like maybe he wins it through brinksmanship. And so this is a subject which is fraught with controversy. Now, we've gone over Carter's presidency a little bit. And if you recall from our conversation, I wasn't really that impressed by Jimmy Carter. But I wanted to find some things that I thought would be nice to say about him, because he really in some ways does represent this attempt to de-escalate Cold War tensions. Carter had a very successful track record on human rights. He was intense about the fact that the US ought to keep their commitments, and it ought not to just do things in its national interest, but to do the right thing by the world. So I don't know what year it was. It was probably in 77 or 78. The treaty with Panama, whereby the US had control of the Panama Canal, was expiring. And rather than sort of send in the military and kind of defend American strategic interests, Jimmy Carter basically said, well, this is Panamanian territory. Let's return it. Carter carried on the very valuable work of Nixon in trying to create arms limitation talks with the Soviet Union. I don't think SALT II was ever really fully implemented because of the crisis that emerged from his presidency, but there was a genuine attempt to continue these negotiations and to take medium-range missiles off the table. He also negotiated this peace between Israel and Egypt, for which he got the Nobel Peace Prize. So significant successes, but his failures are generally seen to outnumber the successes. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1980, kind of moving aggressively into Central Asia. In 1979, the US workers at the Tehran embassy are taken hostage by Iranian revolutionaries. Carter fails to really deal with the energy crisis, and he has no real positive success with dealing with the stagflation problem. Stagflation, if you remember, is the combination between unemployment and inflation, which was pervasive in the late 1970s. And it was a thorny economic issue because policymakers knew that if you raised interest rates, well, that would deal with the inflation problem, but then it's very expensive for business to borrow money. And so you would effectively increase unemployment, and vice versa. You could lower interest rates. That would be really good for unemployment. Businesses would borrow money and they would put people back to work, but then inflation would skyrocket. So using the traditional Keynesian tools of the Federal Reserve Board, Carter didn't really know what to do. And so this is the situation kind of going into 1980. Let me say a little bit about where the Russians are. Khrushchev is somebody that you should be pretty familiar with. Khrushchev was the Soviet leader from the 1950s into the early 60s. He fought the Cold War with bluster. You read about him in the context of the kitchen debate. And he was removed from power after he was perceived by Kremlin hardliners as having caved under pressure from Jack Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he's replaced by the man that you see there center screen, Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev, see all the medals on his chest, and I want you to think of him as a World War II hero, like almost all leaders then after him. He's a man of his generation. He's a man who grew up under Stalin. He's not a man who took risks. He was an absolute insider Communist Party, or he's orthodox. He's not going to take any risk. But the word that scholars use to describe this period in American history, and in Soviet history, is kind of, they use the word calcification. That a system that had been previously a little more flexible under Khrushchev, or ruthless under Stalin, under Brezhnev sort of hardens. And so Brezhnev favors stability over the kind of risk-taking that Khrushchev did. Brezhnev's not going to be replaced the way Khrushchev was. And so there's 5-year plan after 5-year plan that begins to sort of roll out the Soviet kind of continued economic development. But there's actually not all that much innovation. By the mid to the late 70s, it seems like there's unreality to these economic numbers. And maybe, in fact, the Soviet Union is not as economically robust as the statistics say it is. But we don't really know what's happening entirely behind the Iron Curtain. So this is speculation, right? I have a couple of points that actually aren't on the PowerPoint here, but I want to make them to kind of, I want you to have a sense that on the surface of things, it really looks like the Soviet Union is dominant in 1980. They've invaded Afghanistan and they captured it. Western Europe is sort of cowering under the threat of Russian militarism. The United States looks weak. Russia is deploying medium-range nuclear missiles to Poland, and it looks like they have the capacity to wipe out Western Europe before the US can retaliate. And so there's this slogan sort of circulating in Western Europe. There are these massive, in the late 70s and early 80s, anti-nuclear protests where the European left is protesting the existence of American nukes in Britain and in West Germany, and asking the Americans to just sort of get out. And the slogan was better red than dead. If you watched the National Association with Evangelicals speech, I asked you to come take a look at, you'll get Reagan responding to some of this attitude. Like, is it better to be an American and to face this grave risk from the Soviet Union, or would it be better to sell out? And Reagan's, of course, going to say, no, it would be better to be dead than to be communist. But that's a surprising position, actually, if you think about what he's claiming. There are 3 more Soviet strengths that I want to address. First, the Soviet Union is wealthy in the 1970s. I mean, think about what we've been describing in the oil economy, right? Oil prices have quintupled since 1970. The Soviet Union is an industrially developing but minerally rich country. And so the Soviet Union, even though they're not growing economically in terms of their GDP as much as that they would like, they're actually pretty flush with cash in the 1970s, right? And the inflation is driving wealth in the commodities market, and that allows them to spend money on other things. So they have a rich foreign aid policy to insurgents all over the world. They're funding the Cuban military. They are funding kind of socialist rebels in Nicaragua that in 1979 overturn the dictatorship there and replace it with a socialist communist regime on America's southern flank. There are kind of weapons going into Somalia, and both the Russians and the Cubans are heavily supporting communist African sort of insurgents in Angola, which threatens to destabilize South Africa. Okay, the Russians are also aggressively spending on this intermediate nuclear range missile, the SS-20, and America isn't quick to counter that. And so this really reinforces the sense that American allies are weak. The British economy is a basket case. Politics is again moving to the left. And add that to the kind of slice of America, You're Too Young to Die, this record album that was cut by Jerry Falwell, not music, a spoken word record, him preaching. So there really is this sense of like, have we Have we hit our peak? And America from here is going to kind of be this long downward march, like maybe just like Britain in 1910. Maybe Britain peaked and begins this long century of decline. Or is that where we at in the 1970s? Now, I'm not convinced it is. There are sectors of the American economy that are primed to expand. In the 70s, you see the beginnings of the personal computer revolution. Atari's kind of rolling out the first mass successful video games that are being marketed. And I talked about ways in which the Japanese were really good at kind of taking American electronics and copying them and selling them at enormous profit. But the fact is that the American economy still is actually pretty innovative. But it was very difficult for us to compete in this economic environment. Well, a few more words on the Soviets. Leonid Brezhnev dies, I think, in 81 or 82. And I know this PowerPoint says 3, but this is an old PowerPoint, and I'm actually fairly certain there are only 2 Soviet leaders after Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernenko. And the word that Soviet scholars would use to describe them is that they would use this term apparatchik. So these are party insiders, they're bureaucrats, they're officials. They don't have inspiring ideas about how to lead the Soviet Union. They're just going to keep doing the same old thing after the same old thing. And the Soviet Union in the late 1970s is still a tractor and steel economy. They're still operating the way America was in the 1890s. They're mass producing goods, but they haven't really made successfully this revolution into consumer goods, and nor do they have the capacity to do what the American economy is innovating in the late 1970s, which is the shift from vacuum tubes into transistors, and this sort of silicon-based computer economy, which is going to be so innovative in your own lifetime. It's that beginnings of that are happening in the United States and they're not happening in the Soviet Union. Well, in the mid-1980s, and I think I want to say this is 1983, but maybe it was 84, a new leader came to power in the Soviet Union named Mikhail Gorbachev. And you can see him there below. Gorbachev was much younger than the last 3 or 4 kind of Soviet leaders. I think he was actually in his 50s when he came to power, as opposed to like 70s or 80s for Andropov and Chernenko. The Soviet Union, by this point, is in total stagnation. It's a command economy. All of the decisions are made at the top. If I had a classroom full of students, we would kind of do the exercise where I would pretend to be a Communist Party leader, and you would be a student of good communist Marx reading, spouting undergraduates, and I would say, comrades, we have a nursing shortage because of COVID, and I've decided that you're all going to become nursing majors. So like you don't really have choice about your vocation in the Soviet Union. Everyone reads Marx and then everyone's sort of assigned to a particular field. And managers would be assigned that they were managers, often based on their knowledge of Marx and not based on their knowledge of economics. And so this is an inflexible system in which managers are not really held responsible for inefficiency. You aren't really judged for performance. And the system is, again, it's calcifying. Gorbachev shakes things up. He's far less ideological, more flexible. I mean, he'd call himself a Marxist. He's not going to shy away from that. He'd call himself a communist. But he's interested in trying to find ways to restructure. So this word perestroika means restructuring. And the idea is that we're going to change the way things work inside the Soviet Union. So we maybe need more competition at the local level to decide who ought to lead the local Communist Party. So rather than having all the decisions made top down, maybe local officials could engage in some kind of grassroots democracy. And that maybe consumer demand at the local level ought to do more to drive kind of the decisions about what we manufacture. So perestroika is internal, but there are sides in which he's moving away from a kind of Stalinist style command politics and command economy. The word glasnost literally means openness. And it's about Gorbachev's desire to open up trade and exchange and cultural avenues with the Western world. And the fact is that by the mid 80s, the Soviet Union is desperately in need of these technological infusions. Gorbachev is aware of the fact that he doesn't have the capacity to manufacture these transistors. The Americans are developing things in the 1980s like night vision goggles, That if you've ever played certain video games, you know exactly what they do, right? They allow you to fight at nighttime, as if it were not daytime, but you can see into the infrared spectrum and you can see the enemy. Those things are kind of becoming equipped on American special ops forces, and the Soviets don't have them, and so they're trying to get into the global economy as a way to kind of open up trade. It's the sort of thing that China's been really aggressive about in the last decade. Is like, even though China's communist, they have this openness to the American economy, and so Gorbachev wants this. He desperately wants this. Well, let's talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan. We could spend a whole host of time describing why Reagan was elected, but maybe we'll do that in a future lecture, or I'll just kind of work on based off of what you know. And at this point, this is where I would have asked you in class, like, so what do you think about Reagan? What are your general impressions about Reagan? Is his presidency, is his foreign policy a success or a failure? If you watch the NEA speech, what does he say about the Soviet Union? And the quote that you're supposed to come away from that speech understanding is his willingness to call the Soviet Union an evil empire. He shocks his advisors when he does this. And he also kind of spooks the Soviets. Reagan's strategy with the Russians is actually not to try to appease them or backpedal them. He talks tough. He returns to Kennan's strategy of containment, which had really been abandoned in the aftermath of Vietnam, and says that we have to keep them in their economic system where they are. In his very first press conference as president in 1981, he bluntly tells the press that the Soviets were, quote, prepared to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, unquote, in order to spread Marxism across the world. So he takes their doctrine at face value and attempts to contain it. We had become accustomed to treating them as equals in kind of a Nixonian realist foreign policy. So Reagan actually insists that we're their moral superiors. And is sort of, this is the language of 1946 and 1947, when America sort of believed in who we were. But it shocks people, it shocks the press, it shocks Europeans, it shocks liberals, who would sort of come to believe that America had this inherent moral weakness because we'd become the empire, and empire was suspicious. Now, the other thing, the next kind of part of Reagan's strategy is that the Soviet Union could be bankrupted. And this is actually an intensely controversial part of what Reagan does. The Soviet Unions, again, they're at the height of their military power. And Reagan begins a massive push into military spending. The US defense budget in 1980, before he takes office, is $158 billion. By 1987, he's raised it to $241 billion. These billions actually don't seem like a lot of money today, but in the 1980s, that's a staggering sum. So think about what is that in percentage basis, from 158 billion to 241 billion. Reagan doesn't double the defense budget, but he increases it, I think, by something like, I'm eyeballing it, but it looks like about 60%. So as we up our defense spending dramatically, this puts pressure on the Soviet Union to also up their defense spending, right? So they might be spending like 40% of their economy on the military, and mostly on these kind of cash oil sales, right? But they feel like they're forced to kind of up it to 60% in order to keep up with us. And then Reagan compounds that by a piece of deft negotiation with the Arab world. You might have wondered kind of, why are we so engaged with the Middle East, and why does oil come to so dominate kind of American interests at the beginning part of your lifetime? Well, in the 1980s, Reagan developed this rapprochement with the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. At this point in time, they're an absolute monarchy. They have the death penalty for all kinds of other things. They're still largely living under Sharia. This is not a liberal regime at all. And yet Reagan approaches them, befriends them, offers to send them weapons with which they can defend themselves against other kind of proto-socialist regimes like the Syrians or the Iraqis, or maybe the Shia revolutionaries in Iran that the Arabians are terrified. And he is a supporter of families like the Bin Laden family, who had made billions in contracting in the Saudi Arabia. And so Osama bin Laden actually emerges as a freedom fighter in the 1980s from the Bin Laden family, using American weapons in Saudi Arabia, fighting against the Russians. So this is a part of a strategy. he actually convinces the Saudis in the mid-80s to just open up the spigots on oil production and to reverse what had been the oil embargo. And so Reagan gets them to crash the price of global oil. So as they're pumping more oil, the only way that the Russians can respond and make more money is make the same amount of money is for them to pump more oil too. So even as Reagan is spending more and more on defense, the price of oil is crashing. And it's, so there's a sense in which maybe he's bankrupting them, maybe he's taking their economy out. Reagan is negotiating from strength. He doesn't apologize for who the United States is. He doesn't apologize for our allies. He doesn't offer unilateral arms limitation negotiations. He doesn't say, well, the Soviets are a threat, so let's reduce our nuclear weapons to show them that we're not a threat to them. He behaves in a way in the early 1980s that the Russians think that maybe he's actually crazy. They're slightly afraid of him, like maybe he's willing to push the button on a nuclear launch. Andropov and Chernenko in particular, just, I mean, they're terrified of what he's going to do. And there are these war games in 1984 that happen in, I think it's in the North Atlantic Ocean, where things come pretty close to an actual shooting war because no one bothers to tell I mean, imagine this. No one bothers to tell the Russians that these are war games and not an actual invasion. And so the Russians are like going up the escalation. They're getting the nuclear missiles ready. They think that war is imminent. They don't realize that this is just a drill. And Reagan is sort of doing this in order to kind of create this impression in which that they're terrified of. Okay, and then simultaneously, he recognizes that Gorbachev has created this opening for diplomacy. So he approaches the Soviet Union diplomatically in a way that it would have been difficult for Carter to do, or somebody like Hubert Humphrey or Gene McGovern, because it would have been perceived as kind of soft on communism from the left. But because Reagan is on the right, he's been fighting communism his whole life. He was like active in the 1940s and 50s, trained to get communist screenwriters blacklisted in Hollywood. He was a hardcore anti-communist during the Red Scare. So he's not vulnerable. And Reagan then reaches out to Gorbachev and offers to meet with him. And together with Great Britain's leader, Margaret Thatcher, and the moral influence of then Pope Karol Wojtyła, or John Paul II. He was Cardinal Wojtyła and then John Paul II. They say, okay, that's great, Gorbachev. You're interested in human rights. You're interested in openness. You're interested in democracy. Okay, show us that you really are a better sort of communist than what we witnessed under Stalin and Khrushchev, right? Live up to the moral promises that you're making. So this is a combination, to sum up this long section on style. He's confident. Okay, I'm struggling to sum it up. I just want to tell stories. There's an account I read of, I think it's either a CIA officer or who was writing his memoirs, or a historian who later interviewed KGB officials in Gorbachev's entourage who had been with him when he was meeting with Reagan. And so they asked these KGB officials who'd been this eyewitness to history, so what did you think of us during the mid-80s? Like, what did you think that we were up to? And the KGB said, we utterly believed that Reagan was tough, that he was willing to start a war if he thought it was in American interest, that he was, and he had this, but here's the thing, like his style wasn't just like a tough talking, but he's winsome, he's charming. The KGB official used sort of use this expression. It was like the Russians and the Americans were walking along the edge of the cliff. And Reagan spoke to Gorbachev as if, hey, he put his arm around him. This isn't literally, but this was the expression the KGB official used. He put my arm around you, and we walk up to the edge of the cliff. And Reagan says, we believe in reform. We want world peace. And the Russians will say, well, we want world peace too. And Reagan will say, well, in the interest of humanity, then, why don't you take a step out off the edge of the cliff and set aside your weapons and set aside your kind of economic policy and set aside your oil dependence and open up to the West and kind of liberalize and kind of defend the human rights that you say so much about. And like the Russians know that if they do this, if they open up, they're going to be sort of drowned in it under the influence of Western capitalism. But Reagan makes it sound so reasonable and so noble. It's hard to resist him. And so this is a hard thing to puzzle out. In the late 70s, Americans as a whole, again, are depressed about American identity. And they're not sure that we have a bright future. So why is Reagan so sure? Like he believes, this is statesman-like. Churchill's the same way during World War II. He believes, even though it seems like a lot of other folks don't actually believe. Reagan knows that history was on the side of the United States. Things looked bad, but the tide was turning. So in Poland, I mean, Poland, there were signs that Poland wasn't anywhere near as communist as the propaganda said it was, right? So you've got this red and white flag at the bottom of your slide. This is the flag of the Solidarity Workers Union founded by Lech Walesa. And in the late 1970s, they're founded and go out on strike in the shipyards of Gdansk, the old German city of Danzig. And why? Why is that? Well, it's because the workers are angry about communism. This isn't a proletarian society. They're really disgruntled. Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul, goes on a trip to visit Poland in 1979. And he's told by the Russians, okay, well, you're welcome back. You can't really refuse him because he's Polish. You can't go home, right? Well, you know, you can have a small mass with a few of your old friends in this church in Wenceslas Square in old Krakow. But I mean, nobody's going to show up. We're communists. Like this is a good and he has the mass and goes out into Wenceslas Square, and hundreds of thousands of Poles show up to take the sacraments. So the conclusion is, yeah, Poland is really actually non-communist. And that's a signal that Reagan should be confident that things are going to change. Second, Afghanistan. I mean, we've already talked about bin Laden, and the Arabic word for this is the mujahideen, the fighters of freedom, the fighters for, and they considered themselves jihadists against the Russians. It's a kind of holy war. The US is sending in weapons. We're sending in anti-air missiles. They're shooting down the Soviet helicopters. The Soviets are actually being bled dry in the 1980s. This is their Afghanistan. In 1988, they finally say uncle and pull out. And it's kind of humiliating for them. And so there's a sense in which the balance of power is shifting. Reagan begins spending aggressively on the military, kind of signaling that he's willing to project American power globally. Naval spending generally is America's signal that they see themselves as a power that's going to be global, and it's not navies for us aren't so much defensive as offensive. And then Reagan does something kind of crafty with the SDI. SDI was the Strategic Defense Initiative, euphemistically called Star Wars, because in the late 1970s, the Star Wars movies come out. And this seems like really theoretical science. The idea was that you could shoot missiles up into space that would have laser beams pumped by nuclear bombs that would shoot the incoming missiles out of the sky. And like, honestly, American defense experts look at this program and they say, but we don't have the computing power to put on a missile that we'd be able to make the kind of last minute corrections that we would need to kind of get the laser in the right place. This is way too advanced. This is way too beyond us. But Reagan is kind of pummeling. He's pouring millions of dollars into this funding, and he's talking about it openly. And here's the thing. We know that this is really a long way off, but we talk about it like it's coming tomorrow. And so Gorbachev doesn't know that it's not coming tomorrow. And he's frightened of Reagan. He's frightened of what Reagan might do if he gets this thing. If he gets this defensive shield set up, maybe he'd launch a war. So he really wants to find a way to convince Reagan to calm down. So that sets up, on the one hand, the ultimate demise of the Soviet Union. But let me say a little bit about kind of the way in which the nature of this conflict sets up the world that we live in today. So with a return to containment, Reagan, and this isn't just containment in Europe, this is sort of a return to Jack Kennedy style containment. Containment needs to become global, right? So if the US is facing communist revolutionaries in Nicaragua called the Sandinistas, then perhaps the US ought to kind of do to the Russians what the Vietnamese did to us and fund freedom fighters against the regime in Nicaragua, and these were called the Contras. Now, when Congress gets wind of this, they pass an amendment making it illegal to send money to the Contras. But Reagan figures out a way to sort of do this on the sly. And maybe I shouldn't say Reagan, because it happens in the Reagan administration, and Reagan is never proved to have actually made the decisions. But we send missiles to Israel, TOW anti-tank missiles. And the Israelis then sell them to the Iranians. And the Iranians at this point are in this long war with Iraq, and it's a no-holds-barred war in which poison gas is being used. I mean, there are atrocities on both sides in this war. And in exchange for getting these weapons from the Israelis, the Iranians release all of the hostages that they'd taken from the United States. And they were already likely to do this with Reagan as president. But then the Israelis take this money and they send it to the Contras. And so the Israelis, our allies, are actually funding this anti-communist revolution in Nicaragua. And this is illegal. And so when word of this gets out in the second Reagan presidency, it's a huge scandal, and there's this massive congressional investigation, and it threatens to be another Watergate. But it's never proven that Reagan actually had anything directly to do with this. But there's this sort of the sense of presidential power becomes increasingly fraught and increasingly controversial. And yeah, even though Congress originally wanted this, I mean, even though the Democrats originally wanted these strong imperial presidency, by the 1980s, after Nixon and Reagan, the Democrats are increasingly talking about maybe we need, like, things haven't worked like we thought. Okay, another way in which the Reagan Cold War sets up the future is that it's sort of we sort of develop this anti-terror element to the war. So in 1983, we have troops on the ground in Beirut as a way to support our Israeli allies and to kind of keep Lebanon, which had been destabilized, from falling into the hands of Iranian-style Shia terrorists under Hezbollah. And the Hezbollah sends in a car bomb into the hotels and apartments in which American Marines were living. So you see there a photograph of what Osama bin Laden later calls the two towers of Lebanon, right? And the things blow up, and so Reagan orders the Marines out of Lebanon. Now, this is really sort of a tactical retreat. The Marines are still there, but they're no longer going to be stationed in the barracks. They're going to be stationed in American aircraft carriers right off the shore. They can still move in if they need them. But that's seen as a sort of tactical retreat. And so the Islamic world sort of notices maybe the Americans are amenable, that you could pressure them. A few casualties in there, they'll put tail and run. Now, that's not what Reagan's trying to be strategic and say, this is not a battle we need to fight. This is actually shrewd. He's not getting into another Vietnam and Lebanon. But the Arabs, not just the Arabs, it's not all the Arabs. Many of the Arabs are our allies. The terrorists involved see this as a victory for them. And increasingly, Reagan sort of commits himself as part of fighting the Soviet Union to fighting this network of terrorists in Libya and Syria and Iran. And this is a transition point that I think that the war on terror from our point of view starts from 9/11. But the war on terror from Osama bin Laden's point of view is a common war that the Russians and the Americans were fighting that dates back into the 1980s. Okay, a couple more points and we'll wrap it up. So Reagan and Gorbachev, why is this relationship such a big deal? Gorbachev comes to power in 1985. And he doesn't recognize everything we've laid out. I don't think he understands Reagan the way that Reagan understands the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev feels very much pressured to get close to Reagan, to convince him not to be so bellicose, not to be so aggressive. So they have a series of summit meetings. Summit diplomacy is the process by which the two leaders meet together face to face and try to find a way to lower tensions and create a nuclear weapons agreement. Gorbachev is anxious to bring Reagan to the table. I think Reagan perceives this. He knows that Gorbachev needs Reagan more than Reagan needs Gorbachev. So when Gorbachev comes to power, he stops nuclear testing, he ends nuclear deployment to Eastern Europe, and he agrees in principle to the idea of on-site inspections in a nuclear arms limitation treaty, so that the Americans can send inspectors into Russia to verify that the weapons are destroyed, and vice versa. So tentatively, Reagan agrees to meet with Gorbachev. I don't think expecting all that much to happen. They meet in Geneva in 1985 in front of a fireplace with just a pair of translators, but they discover that they actually have some rapport with one another. They agreed to meet again in Reykjavik in 1986, and they're actually considering that the proposal that's on the table was in 5 years to have a 50% reduction in nuclear weapons on both sides. And Reagan makes a surprising counteroffer. Gorbachev proposes 50%, and Reagan says, why not 100%? Which just freaks the living daylights out of everyone in the Defense Department and the State Department, because this is just sort of Reagan. Like, this is the spooky kind of Reagan. And the Russians are like, well, can we trust him? Is he going to betray us? And Gorbachev very much feels like he can't do this because of what happened to Khrushchev, right? If he's seen as being too weak, the Communist Party is going to take him out. So he says, okay, but you've got to give me more than that, because you not only have these offensive weapons, but you have this defensive system. Why don't you get rid of your defensive weapons too? And Reagan basically says, no, our defensive system doesn't threaten you, which I don't know if that's technically true. A defensive system actually sort of makes you bulletproof. Reagan doesn't do it. Now, this is silly, because the SDI Star Wars program isn't actually even very effective, right? I mean, so what does anybody have to lose by giving it up? But Reagan, like, he's sort of gotten inside his head, and so he refuses. He walks away from the table, and won't give up. Now, eventually, Gorbachev decides, by 1987, he decides that SDI really is propaganda. And he reaches an arms deal to eliminate all intermediate nuclear weapons from Europe. That's the INF agreement. Now, you still have intercontinental ballistic missiles in both countries. You can still destroy the world multiple times over, but you're getting rid of the fast deploying weapons that were perceived by the Europeans as being such a threat. And then there's a nuclear accident in Chernobyl, which sort of signals to lots of people in Eastern and Central Europe that the Soviet is not as sophisticated as it would have seemed, right? And a large chunk of the Ukraine becomes uninhabitable for a little while. And people up in Finland have to slaughter their reindeer herd because they've been so contaminated by the radiation that you can't even eat. And there's great anger in Eastern Europe at Gorbachev because of what's happened. This is the context in which Reagan gives the Brandenburg Gate address that I had you listen to. You know, he says to Gorbachev, you say that you want openness. What do you mean by openness? You want this trade with the West, you want our technology, but you need to show us that your rhetoric about perestroika is not just rhetoric, but you're willing to actually have elections and demonstrate genuine democratic reform in order for us to kind of give you what you want. And so that at this point, Russia's kind of reeling. They pull out of Afghanistan. And Reagan says, okay, well, maybe we can have some kind of, so he goes to Russia in the last year of his presidency. He begins this process of negotiation. It looks like we've arrived at like patience talks. And so at the end of Reagan's presidency, it seems like the Cold War is genuinely thawing. Now, I was alive in 1988. I was a politically aware junior high kid. And I was blown away by how fast everything fell apart. I'm going to come back to George Kennan, and we talked about it in the context of the long telegram. George Kennan's policy of containment, in my mind, is what actually wins the Cold War. Now, lots of scholars would disagree. I'm making a controversial argument here. Plenty of scholars who would gravitate toward the left would argue that it was actually Gorbachev's openness and his reform that won the day over Reagan's kind of bellicose militant hardline stuff. I think that Reagan played Gorbachev more than Gorbachev played Reagan. But Reagan was firm where he needed to be firm. So by drawing hard lines and recognizing that the Soviet Union actually was a dysfunctional economy, Kennan predicted that the Soviet Union would eventually die of its own inefficiency if it could be contained and prevented from a military victory. I think this is what happens in 1989. This is how it unfolds. There are democratic elections in Russia. The anti-communists win in places where the Russians are a little unpopular. Places like Armenia, Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, right, where Chernobyl happened, not surprising that the non-communists win there, and Estonia. The Russians are pretty upset about this, but Gorbachev announces that he will respect the territorial sovereignty of the other Soviet socialist republics, that if they want to have representative officials who aren't all communists, that's fine with him. They're still a part of the Soviet Union. They're still paying the taxes. But you have to allow the communists to maybe occasionally get defeated sometimes if you want them to change and to be efficient. So if you want creativity politically, you have to be willing to take some losses sometimes. And Stalin, not Stalin, no, it's Stalin. Gorbachev signals subtly that he also wants this kind of reform in the Eastern Bloc countries. So border restrictions are loosened as part of this glasnost. And this is in July and then August. Thousands of people begin to pack their bags in the border counties, the border provinces of Germany, Poland, and especially Hungary, and literally just walk toward the border without their cars. They cross over rural mountain back roads. Gorbachev is allowed for some kind of border crossing for tourism, but literally these people are sort of, they have a backpack filled with some clothes and some food, and they intend never to come back. Like, they think that this is not going to last. There's going to be a crackdown. And the situation intensifies by August and September. The whole thing comes to a head on 9 November of 1989. There are these sort of crossings around rural borders, but people attempted to sort of make this crossing in what was called Checkpoint Charlie in the middle of the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburg Gate. And they start doing this late at night, and the soldiers are like, I'm not sure if we're supposed to allow East Berliners across the line here. And so they call up the chain of command, and eventually they get the guy in East Berlin calls the guy in charge in Moscow and says, what are we supposed to do? And it's like, well, you're a sovereign country, you decide. Like, this isn't up to us. And sort of recognizing that they could do what they want, the border guards throw the border open, and this giant spontaneous party emerges at the Berlin Wall. And the people of Berlin on both sides show up with like jackhammers and chisels and hammers and literally take the Berlin Wall apart. And it just collapses. The German system totally collapses. When the East Germans realize that they can actually do what they want, they reunite with the West Germans in less than 1 year. And by 1991, The Soviets have settled this final treaty with the Americans where they're going to reduce nuclear weapons by 1/3, and we're no longer going to have this race to see how many world-destroying weapons we can have, and we can begin to cut down to more normal levels. I'm not sure what normal would be, but maybe 50 or 100 weapons to kind of give you a deterrence against China, but you don't need 3,000 nuclear warheads to really have an effective deterrence. And then the generals launched this military coup against Gorbachev, and he's thrown out of power. He's arrested while he's on vacation in August of, I think, 91 in his dacha. Or this is 90. No, this is 90. And the mayor of Moscow, a man by the name of Boris Yeltsin, resists, and the parliament in Moscow resists, and the Russian generals decide that they're not going to fire on their own people and their own troops. They no longer even believe in the Soviet system. And some of them go into exile, some of them commit suicide. By 1991, the Russian government is completely dissolved. Sorry, the Soviet Union is completely dissolved and the republics come off. And it's actually not at all clear what this means. This is a great shift in American power. And it's a question mark. I'll use this kind of as a stopping point and a hinge point for the next conversation we'll have. Probably, this is something we might wrap up after break, leading into 9/11. But there's a really famous article, we'll close with this. There's a really famous article by Francis Fukuyama that was published in Foreign Affairs, I think in 88, maybe it was in 87, maybe it was in 89, called The End of History. And it was later turned into a book that Dr. Meilander likes to assign, The End of History in the Last Minute. And it's an analysis of how the triumph of the West over the East represented the final conflict in a long series of modernization conflicts. And so history was essentially over. The long unfolding of modernity that began with the French Revolution ends in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there are winners and there are losers, and there's maybe some mopping up operations, but Fukuyama assumed, and people jubilantly kind of bought into the idea in 1989 that history was over and that we had won. And that was the end of the Cold War. And the question of what does it mean, we'll have to kind of leave for another presidency, because that's really the work of the George H.W. Bush presidency and of Bill Clinton. So that covers the lecture for today, and we will stop here and pick up with discussions of you'll get an email from me later on kind of referring to what you're supposed to read and what you're supposed to do. All right, good afternoon.